Before the jungle swallowed the cities, and before Angkor Wat crowned the Khmer horizon, there was only chaos. The land that would become Cambodia was carved into warring principalities, ruled by its own ambitions, each bound by ancient beliefs, but fractured by shifting power. It was not a kingdom, it was a battlefield. Out of this broken world stepped a man cloaked in mystery, his origins whispered in exile, his destiny sealed in ritual. His name was Jayavarman II. He did not merely want to rule, he sought to transcend. With sword and sacred rite, he unified the splintered lands and claimed something no ruler before him dared: divinity. In a mountain ritual cloaked in blood and legend, Jayavarman declared himself Chakravartin, universal monarch ordained by the gods, not elected by men. It was more than a coronation. It was a cosmic upheaval. The gods would no longer reside in the heavens. They would walk through stone temples and speak through kings. This is not the story of a man. It is the story of a transformation, of how belief can bend power, of how one oath atop a sacred mountain gave birth to an empire of gods. Part 1. A King from the Shadows. Jayavarman's path to power. Before he was crowned a god, Jayavarman II was a fugitive prince in a crumbling world. The 8th century lands of present-day Cambodia were no kingdom. They were fragments, fractured chieftains, half-forgotten dynasties, and the ghost of Funan, the once mighty maritime realm that had long since vanished into trade winds and legend. The region known as Chenla had splintered under its own weight, its rulers too focused on their own glory to guard against rising foreign tides. Java, modern-day Indonesia, had grown powerful and hungry, casting its influence across the sea, installing puppet kings, and reaching its hand deep into mainland Asia. In this chaos, Jayavarman was not yet a name of reverence, but of survival. Born into one of the many noble lines vying for power, he was taken to Jayavarman as a hostage, an exile, or a student. The histories are uncertain, shrouded in smoke and speculation. What is clear is that when he returned, he was no longer merely a claimant. He was something else, hardened, focused, anointed by fire in foreign court. And he had a vision. He returned not to sit on a throne, but to build one from the bones of the old world. Jayavarman moved with cold precision, first establishing his base in the Mekong Basin before pushing north and west, swallowing rival territories through war, diplomacy, and calculated marriages. He did not proclaim empire, he earned it through blood and iron. Every region brought into his fold gave him legitimacy. Every rebel crushed proved he was not merely a prince of warlords, but a unifier. His warriors fought in the lowland jungles and marched through sacred valleys. His scribes carried with them a new language of rule, one where kings did not serve gods, but became them. Jayavarman's greatest weapon was not the sword, but belief. To rule land was power. To rule the soul was permanence. He did not want to be remembered. He wanted to reshape memory itself. In the year 802, high atop the sacred heights of Phnom Kulen, Jayavarman II summoned his priests, his generals, his scribes, and his shadows. There, far from the eyes of rival kings and foreign meddlers, he performed a ritual that would redefine the region for centuries. The Devaraja ceremony, the rite of the god king, rooted in Shaiva Hinduism and fueled by ancient Vedic tradition. The rite proclaimed Jayavarman not just as ruler of men, but as the earthly incarnation of Shiva himself. Through sacred fire, offerings, and mantras lost to time, he declared Cambodia no longer a collection of feuding states. It was now a single empire, and he, its universal monarch Chakravartin. The heavens were realigned. The gods had chosen. It was not a crowning, it was a cosmic shift. After the rite, he did not return to a palace, but to a project, to an empire being born not in marble but in laterite and jungle stone. He began building his capital near Mahendraparva, forging a new seat of power rooted in spiritual geography. This was no accident. The mountain's location was symbolic. It was both a natural fortress and a cosmic axis. Mount Meru, the sacred mountain of the gods in Hindu cosmology, was mirrored here on earth. Jayavarman's court was now not just political, it was divine terrain. Every structure, every chamber, every causeway reflected celestial order, and under this spiritual blueprint, his empire spread like roots through the jungle floor. But even gods must guard their thrones. Jayavarman's reign was not without resistance. Local lords who refused to bend to the god king were met with swift justice. Cities were razed, blood spilled in rivers as sacred as any shrine. His warriors, elite, hardened, and loyal, moved swiftly, crushing pockets of rebellion and extinguishing claims of rival kings. His enemies called it tyranny, his followers called it destiny. Beneath the spiritual grandeur lay a system of brutal pragmatism. Rice was taxed, labor was conscripted, families were displaced to support temple construction. Every pillar rose on the shoulders of peasants who had no choice but to believe. For them, Jayavarman was not just a king, he was law, sky, earth, and fate. Rituals replaced rebellion. Offerings silenced opposition. The lines between governance and divinity blurred until they were one. Outside the royal cities, life remained a struggle. Monsoon seasons washed away homes, wild animals hunted the dark, and the jungle swallowed the unprotected. But within this uncertainty, Jayavarman offered structure, a divine order. For many, that was enough. Temples were not just religious centers, they were hubs of economy, grain storage, social control. Priests became administrators, farmers became believers, and everywhere, the presence of the God King lingered, his name carved into stone, his image etched into memory. Even the smallest villages received inscriptions honoring his rule, a written net cast over the land, trapping every soul in the myth of his divinity. Through this, a nation was born not from a constitution, but from faith. By the end of his reign, Jayavarman II had built not merely a realm, but a world unto itself. His influence stretched from the Dangrek Mountains to the shores of the Mekong. The old tribal boundaries were erased, replaced by highways of stone and devotion. He laid the first foundation of what would become the Khmer Empire, the largest and most enduring power in Southeast Asia for the next 6 centuries. Yet Jayavarman left behind no vast temple of his own, no tomb in his likeness, no epic carved in victory. His legacy was something deeper. He did not seek to be worshipped in one place, but everywhere. His temples were the empire. His body was the land. He vanished into the very structure he created, becoming myth before death. And so the foundations were laid, not in mortar, but in belief, not in armies, but in stories. A prince who rose from the shadows, a king who became a god, a man who stood on a mountain and dared to rewrite heaven. Jayavarman II did not simply unite a people, he rewrote the meaning of rule itself. Part 2. The Sacred Oath on Phnom Kulen, Birth of a Divine Empire. The jungle was not silent on the day the gods descended. Wind moved through the trees like whispers of forgotten spirits. Smoke rose in tendrils from sacred braziers as chants echoed across the mountaintop. The summit of Phnom Kulen had been prepared, not for battle, but for revelation. Priests in blood-colored robes stood in concentric circles. A sacred fire burned at the heart of the ritual ground, and at its center stood a man who was no longer just a king. Jayavarman II, the unifier of war-torn lands, was ready to become something far greater. He had already conquered territory with sword and strategy, but now he would conquer time. He had gathered his council, his warriors, and the holy men of the realm to bear witness to the Devaraja ceremony, rite older than memory, whispered in the shadow of Vedic fire, hidden beneath layers of Hindu cosmology and Khmer tradition. This was no coronation, it was a transformation. Through this rite, Jayavarman would not simply rule over land and people. He would become the physical vessel of Shiva, Lord of destruction and rebirth. The kingdom would become the center of the universe, and he, its axis. The ritual began with mantras carved in sound, syllables designed not for meaning, but for power. Sacred texts were recited until breath grew short and the world began to tremble with vibration. Offerings were cast into fire grains, oil, the blood of beasts, each sacrifice a step toward unlocking the divine. A lingam, the stone pillar symbolizing Shiva's eternal presence, was consecrated to represent the merging of heaven and earth within the body of the king. The sky darkened, wind howled, thunder cracked in the far distance, or perhaps just in the minds of those too close to the veil, and then it was done. Jayavarman II stood no longer as a mortal ruler, but as Chakravartin, the wheel-turning monarch, a king sanctioned by cosmic law to command the world. Those who watched bowed, not out of fear, but because the fabric of reality had shifted. The king was now divine. That night, fires burned across hilltops. Messengers rode out into the lowlands. The fragmented lands of the Khmer were no longer provinces of quarrelsome lords. They were now the limbs of a sacred body, bound to a center that pulsed on top of Phnom Kulen. A kingdom had ended. An empire had begun. In the years that followed, Jayavarman did not waste time basking in ceremony. He began a campaign of unification that reached into every corner of his realm. Roads were cleared, temples erected, declarations etched into stone for generations to read. But unlike the kingdoms of the West, the Khmer Empire did not rise first through trade or conquest, it rose through sacred architecture. Temples became tools of governance, sacred networks that mapped the divine across the land. Each structure mirrored Mount Meru, the celestial mountain at the center of the universe, its spires pointing skyward like stone prayers. The people did not merely live beneath their rulers, they lived beneath gods. Local leaders, once semi-independent, were turned into administrators of the central will. Jayavarman's court established a new social contract, not signed in ink, but sanctified by faith. The king gave protection, order, and divine legitimacy. In return, the people gave loyalty, labor, and their very lives. The empire grew, not like a tree, but like a ritual, measured, symbolic, intentional, and beneath its surface pulsed the rhythm of devotion. Rice was harvested with songs to the gods. Children were taught the names of deities before their own. Even war was framed not as conquest, but as divine correction, removing disorder to maintain balance. But beneath the sacred order lay the weight of sacrifice. Great temples rose from the sweat and blood of commoners, whose names would never be carved in stone. Laborers carried sandstone blocks across flooded plains, hauling the pieces of paradise into place. Craftsmen chiseled the faces of gods they would never worship, working in heat that melted skin and rain that drowned hope. The jungle did not yield easily. It fought back with disease, with rot, with unseen predators. But belief drove them forward. Every blister, every broken bone, every life lost was part of a larger design. They were not just building monuments, they were building eternity. Phnom Kulen itself became more than a sacred site. It was the holy spine of the empire, a mountain of origin, a mountain of memory. Pilgrims came to touch the ground where the gods had walked. Kings returned in later centuries to renew the oath. The Devaraja rite had not only made Jayavarman a god, it had forged the very identity of the Khmer people. From his vision, a civilization emerged that defied time. Jayavarman's successors would expand his legacy, carving their own myths into the landscape. Cities would rise with precise cosmological order. Perei's enormous man-made reservoirs would mirror the oceans of Hindu myth. Temples would spread like constellations across the land. But it was Jayavarman who had written the first line of the epic. It was he who taught future kings not just how to rule, but how to be worshipped. And for centuries, they followed his footsteps, believing that rule was not about governance, but divine alignment. Yet, even in greatness, shadows lingered. The god-king system he created demanded perfection. It demanded constant construction, endless labor, unshakable belief. A single drought could feel like divine punishment. A failed harvest could be seen as the king falling out of favor with the gods. And so the kings who followed built higher, carved deeper, spent more. The spiral had begun. But in Jayavarman's time, the vision remained unspoiled. His death was not marked by rebellion or failure, but by the slow enshrinement of myth. He vanished into his empire, like stone into jungle. No grand funeral pyre, no carved portrait, just inscriptions dry, firm, eternal, left to echo beneath the canopy. Today, you can walk the steps of Phnom. You can hear the water flowing through the river of 1,000 linkas, where sacred stones were carved beneath the surface to sanctify the kingdom's water before it flowed to the capital. You can feel the weight of time in the humid air. The mountain still watches, the stones still speak. Jayavarman II is no longer a man, or even a king. He is a presence, a silence between leaves, a gaze behind every stone face in Angkor. His empire may have crumbled, but the oath remains. Every temple built after him is a verse in a scripture that began the moment he stood atop that mountain and declared that the gods had returned. And so, beneath the roots and ruins, beneath the awe and architecture, lies the truth. Jayavarman II did not build an empire of land. He built an empire of belief. And that, long after stone is broken and names forgotten, is what truly endures. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history.